Margaret Collins stood on the wet sand of Coronado Beach, her weathered face impassive as 20-something Navy SEAL candidates snickered behind their hands. The morning fog hung thick over the Pacific, shrouding the obstacle course in ghostly gray as the recruits assessed the 60-year-old woman who had just been introduced as their special training instructor. "This has to be some kind of joke," one whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. What they didn't know was that Margaret had spent 40 years perfecting the art of turning impossible situations into inevitable victories. By the end of that day, every single one of those young men would understand exactly why she had been chosen to teach them what true endurance really meant. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Naval Special Warfare Training Center at Coronado Island hummed with the controlled chaos of pre-dawn preparation as Commander James Reeves reviewed personnel files in his office. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his desk, where 28 candidate profiles were arranged in meticulous order. Each folder contained the history of exceptional athletes and soldiers who had survived the initial screening process to attempt BUD-S Basic Underwater Demolition / SEAL training, the most physically and mentally demanding military qualification program in existence. Reeves frowned at the troubling pattern emerging from recent training cycles. Despite recruiting the strongest, fastest candidates in naval history, completion rates had fallen to concerning levels. These young men arrived with impressive physical metrics, but lacked something essential that couldn't be measured in standard assessments. When they encountered the true crucible of SEAL training, something was breaking inside them before their bodies gave out. "We're selecting the wrong attributes," Reeves muttered, closing the last file with a decisive snap. The decision he'd made would prove either brilliant or career-ending, but after 27 years commanding special operations units, he trusted his instincts more than bureaucratic convention. He'd received authorization for an experimental training approach, though his superiors had expressed significant reservations about his unorthodox choice of instructor. Outside his window, Reeves could see the infamous obstacle course where countless candidates had confronted their first real test. Beyond that, the Pacific Ocean stretched to the horizon, deceptively peaceful in the pre-dawn light. Within hours, his candidates would be suffering in those frigid waters, facing the initial filter designed to eliminate those who lacked the essential qualities needed for special operations. But this class would face something the others hadn't: a fundamental challenge to everything they believed about strength, endurance, and mental fortitude. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Daniels entered the office precisely at 0500, his posture reflecting years of disciplined service. "The candidates are assembled, sir." And he hesitated, his professional demeanor slipping momentarily. "She's here." Reeves nodded, rising from his desk. "Your concerns are noted, Chief. But I need you to trust me on this." Daniels' expression remained carefully neutral. "Of course, sir. Though I should mention the other instructors are expressing significant skepticism about this approach." "They're supposed to be skeptical," Reeves replied, straightening his uniform. "That's exactly why this will work." The assembled candidates stood at rigid attention as Commander Reeves approached, their breath creating small clouds in the chilly morning air. Each man represented the peak of military fitness: former college athletes, reconnaissance Marines, champion swimmers, all believing they had what it took to join the elite fraternity of Navy SEALs. Their confident expressions suggested they had faced challenges before and conquered them through superior physical ability and determination. What they didn't yet understand was that BUD-S was designed to break that confidence systematically, to strip away preconceptions and rebuild candidates from their foundations. The 80% attrition rate wasn't a bug in the system, it was its primary feature. SEAL training didn't build exceptional operators so much as identify the rare individuals who already possessed the necessary qualities and eliminate everyone else. "Gentlemen," Reeves began, his voice carrying across the formation without needing to shout, "you've been selected for BUD/Class 347 because you represent the finest physical specimens the Navy can recruit. You've passed the screening tests, impressed your commanding officers, and convinced the selection board that you deserve a chance to earn your trident." The candidates remained motionless, though subtle shifts in their posture betrayed their pride at the acknowledgement of their accomplishments. "However," Reeves continued, his tone hardening, "history tells us that fewer than 20% of you will complete this training. Not because the exercises are impossible, they aren't. Not because the standards are too high, They're exactly where they need to be. You will fail because, despite your impressive physical capabilities, most of you fundamentally misunderstand what this program is designed to identify. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Reeves paced slowly before the formation, studying each face with the evaluative gaze of someone who had witnessed countless promising candidates surrender to their limitations. Bud/S isn't primarily a physical challenge. It's a revelation of character. The physical suffering is merely the medium through which your true qualities emerge. For this reason, I've decided that Class 347 will experience a significant modification to the traditional training approach. A slight ripple of tension moved through the formation as candidates processed this unexpected announcement. Training modifications typically meant additional hardship, not relief. "You will report to Instructor Collins for your morning evolution," Reeves stated, gesturing toward a figure who had been standing quietly to the side. Margaret Collins stepped forward with the unhurried confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her weathered face showed the calm self-possession of a person who had faced genuine challenges rather than manufactured ones. At 5'6" and 140 pounds, she appeared entirely unremarkable in her Navy-issue physical training uniform, except for her age, which was unmistakably inconsistent with the typical SEAL instructor profile. The formation maintained discipline, but the shock was evident in subtle shifts of posture and barely concealed expressions of disbelief. One candidate, at the end of the front row, failed to control his reaction entirely, a small snort of derision escaping before he could suppress it. Margaret's eyes found him immediately, her gaze neither angry nor defensive, merely evaluative, as though she were making note of a specimen with obvious defects. "This is Margaret Collins," Reeves continued, ignoring the visible skepticism. "She holds the rank of Senior Chief Petty Officer, retired. For reasons that remain classified, her service record is not available for your review. What you need to know is that Instructor Collins will be overseeing your physical conditioning program and leading key training evolutions throughout your Bud/S experience." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken questions and assumptions. These young men, most in their early 20s, couldn't conceive of how a 60-year-old woman could possibly contribute to their development as special operators. Their expressions ranged from confusion to outright dismissal, though military discipline kept most from revealing their thoughts openly. "Instructor Collins will now address you," Reeves said, stepping aside with the satisfied expression of someone who had just placed a particularly interesting piece on a chessboard. Margaret stepped forward, her movements economical and deliberate. When she spoke, her voice carried easily across the formation without straining, the voice of someone accustomed to being heard the first time. "Gentlemen, I understand your confusion. You're looking at me and seeing someone who doesn't match your conception of what a SEAL instructor should be. That's understandable. Preconceptions are comfortable. They give us a framework for processing the world without having to think too hard." She paused, letting her gaze move across the formation. Several candidates shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. The problem with preconceptions is that they create blind spots. In combat, blind spots get people killed. My job is to identify and eliminate your blind spots before they cost you or your teammates their lives. Margaret began walking slowly along the front rank, studying each candidate with clinical detachment. "You've all arrived here believing that your physical capabilities are your greatest assets. You're proud of your strength, your speed, your endurance. You should be. They represent years of dedicated effort." She stopped in front of a particularly muscular candidate whose service record indicated he had been a collegiate wrestling champion. "But those attributes aren't what will determine your success here. Physical capabilities are merely table stakes, the minimum requirement to begin this process." Margaret resumed her position in front of the formation. "What you don't yet understand is that your bodies will fail you during this training. Every single one of you will reach a point where your muscles can no longer perform as commanded, where your lungs burn with each breath, where your limbs feel like concrete and your mind screams for relief." Her voice remained conversational, which somehow made her words more impactful than if she had been shouting. "At that moment, when your physical advantages have been neutralized, we discover who you really are. Some of you will quit. Some will find excuses, Some will convince yourselves that continuing isn't worth the suffering. And a very few will discover something beyond physical capability that allows you to continue when your body has nothing left to give. She smiled slightly, though there was no warmth in the expression. My role is to accelerate that process of discovery. By the end of today, you'll begin to understand why Commander Reeves brought me here. The formation maintained its discipline, but the atmosphere had shifted subtly. The initial amusement had been replaced by uncertainty, as Margaret's words penetrated their preconceptions. These men had faced intimidating instructors before, drill sergeants who screamed in their faces, commanding officers who demanded impossible standards. But something about Margaret's quiet confidence suggested a different kind of challenge. "You have 5 minutes to change into full water gear," she announced. "When you return, we'll begin with a simple assessment of your current capabilities." As the candidates double time to the barracks, Margaret turned to Commander Reeves with a knowing look. "They think this is a joke." Reeves nodded. "That's the point. Their expectations are about to become their first real obstacle." Margaret smiled, this time genuinely. "By noon, they'll understand. By tomorrow, half of them will be gone." When the candidates reassembled on the beach, they found Margaret standing at the water's edge, still in her standard PT uniform, rather than the wetsuit they had expected an instructor to wear. The morning fog had thinned slightly, revealing the choppy gray water of the Pacific stretching to the horizon. "Today's evolution is simple," Margaret announced as they formed ranks before her. "We'll begin with a 2-mile ocean swim, followed immediately by a 4-mile beach run. Then 5 minutes of push-ups, 5 minutes of pull-ups, and 5 minutes of flutter kicks. We'll repeat this circuit 3 times without breaks." The candidates exchanged glances. While challenging, this was a standard conditioning evolution they had all prepared for. Some even appeared relieved that their first test would be so conventional despite the unconventional instructor. "To ensure proper motivation," Margaret continued, "I'll be completing the circuit alongside you. Anyone who finishes behind me will be dropped from training immediately." A ripple of surprised murmurs broke the formation's discipline. The candidate who had snorted earlier now openly laughed, quickly trying to disguise it as a cough when Chief Daniels glared in his direction. Margaret noted the reaction without comment, her expression unchanged. "Additionally, I'll be completing the circuit under the same standards expected of candidates 30 years ago, which were significantly more demanding than today's requirements." She stepped to the edge of the water. "You have the advantage of youth, strength, and specialized preparation. I have the advantage of experience and knowing exactly what this training is designed to reveal. We'll see which proves more valuable." The candidates lined up at the water's edge, many still fighting to conceal their amusement at the idea that they might be outperformed by someone who could be their grandmother. Their expressions conveyed the particular confidence of young men who had never encountered physical challenges they couldn't overcome through superior strength and determination. "Begin on my mark," Margaret said calmly. 3, 2, 1, mark. The candidates surged into the frigid Pacific, their powerful strokes quickly carrying them through the breaking surf into deeper water. Several glanced back, expecting to see Margaret struggling in the shallows, only to find her swimming with smooth, efficient strokes that belied her age. She wasn't keeping pace with the leaders, but her technique suggested someone intimately familiar with ocean swimming. The first leg of the swim took them parallel to the shore for 1 mile before turning back. As they reached the turning point, the current strengthened and the chop increased, creating challenging conditions that began to separate the candidates based on their swimming abilities. The strongest were already pulling ahead, confident in their superior conditioning. What they failed to notice was that Margaret had settled into a rhythm that seemed almost leisurely, not fighting the ocean's resistance but working with it, finding the most efficient path through the water with minimal energy expenditure. While the candidates powered through the waves with impressive but wasteful strength, she moved like someone who understood that the ocean couldn't be conquered, only negotiated with. As they approached the shore to complete the first swim leg, the initial confidence of many candidates had already eroded. The cold water had sapped their strength more quickly than expected, and the constant battle against the current had drained energy they had planned to conserve for later evolutions. To their surprise, Margaret emerged from the water in the middle of the pack, showing none of the fatigue that marked the faces of men 1/3 her age. Without pausing to rest, she transitioned smoothly to the beach run, setting a pace that appeared moderate, but covered ground with deceptive efficiency. Again, her technique revealed someone who understood that endurance wasn't about maximum effort but optimal effort, sustainability rather than speed. By the halfway point of the first run, several candidates who had led in the swim were now struggling to maintain pace. Their powerful builds, advantageous in the water, became liabilities on the soft sand that drained strength from each footstep. Margaret, meanwhile, seemed to float across the beach, her feet finding the most compressed sand with each stride, her posture balanced to conserve energy rather than project power. Candidate Ryan Mitchell, the former wrestling champion, found himself running alongside Margaret, his breathing already labored while hers remained controlled. "With respect, ma'am," he managed between breaths. "How are you doing this?" Margaret glanced at him with the same evaluative look she had given the formation earlier. "I'm not fighting myself, Mr. Mitchell. You're carrying 60 pounds of muscle that you don't need for this evolution. Every step, you're battling your own weight along with the sand and fatigue." She maintained her pace without apparent effort, but that's not the real difference. You're running like someone who expects this to end soon, putting out maximum effort for what you think is a sprint. I'm running like someone who knows this is just the beginning of a very long journey. Mitchell had no response, having used his available breath for the question. He fell back gradually as Margaret maintained her steady pace, her words echoing in his mind as he struggled to adjust his approach. When they completed the run and moved to the push-up station, the true separation began. Candidates who had excelled in the water and on the beach now faced the consequences of their earlier exertion. Muscles already fatigued from swimming and running failed progressively during the calisthenics, reducing their numbers with each passing minute. Margaret, meanwhile, performed each exercise with the same measured efficiency she had shown throughout. Her push-ups weren't as deep as the candidates, her pull-ups not as explosive, but they were consistent and unceasing. Where the young men's performance declined precipitously over the 5-minute intervals, hers remained almost unchanged from beginning to end. By the time they completed the first circuit, 7 candidates had already fallen so far behind that continuing seemed pointless. They stood on the beach, watching in disbelief as Margaret began the second swim without hesitation, her stroke pattern unchanged despite having completed the same exhausting evolution they had. "This is impossible," gasped candidate James Torres, a former competitive swimmer who had led the first ocean leg but now found himself struggling to enter the water for the second circuit. "She should be destroyed after that. How is she not even breathing hard?" Quote, Chief Daniels, who had been observing from the shore, offered no sympathy. "Perhaps you should be asking what she understands that you don't, rather than assuming the task is impossible." As the second circuit progressed, the true purpose of Margaret's role became increasingly apparent. This wasn't simply a physical test. It was a fundamental challenge to the candidates, understanding of what constituted effective performance. Those who continued to rely on youthful strength and speed found themselves depleted before reaching the halfway mark. Those who began to adapt, adjusting their techniques to emulate Margaret's efficiency, discovered resources they hadn't known they possessed. By the final circuit, only 11 candidates remained in contention. The others had either fallen so far behind that they had effectively eliminated themselves or had simply stopped, their bodies refusing to continue despite their determination. Margaret, remarkably, maintained virtually the same pace she had established at the beginning, like a metronome that couldn't be disturbed by external conditions. As they completed the final set of flutter kicks, Margaret stood and surveyed the shattered remains of Class 347. Most lay on the sand in various states of exhaustion, their preconceptions about physical capability and age having been systematically dismantled over the past 4 hours. "Congratulations to those of you who completed the evolution," quote, she said, her breathing controlled despite having performed the same workout that had destroyed men who should have easily outperformed her. "You've taken your first step toward understanding what this training is actually designed to reveal." She walked among them, studying their condition with the detached interest of a scientist observing experimental subjects. "The rest of you have a decision to make. You can interpret today's failure as evidence that the standards are unfair, or that I possess some superhuman abilities that excuse your performance. Or you can recognize that you've encountered the first of many revelations this training will offer, that your current understanding of human capability is fundamentally flawed." Margaret stopped beside candidate Mitchell, who had managed to complete the evolution despite his earlier struggles. "Mr. Mitchell made an important discovery today. Would you care to share your insight with your classmates? Mitchell pushed himself to a sitting position, his face reflecting both exhaustion and dawning comprehension. It's not about power, he said, his voice hoarse from exertion. It's about efficiency, sustainability. I was trying to dominate each evolution with maximum effort, but that's not how this works. She wasn't faster or stronger than us. She was smarter, more efficient. She knew exactly how much effort each task required and didn't waste anything. Margaret nodded approvingly at Mitchell's insight, her expression revealing nothing of the satisfaction she felt at seeing the first glimmer of genuine understanding. Correct. This program isn't designed to find the strongest or fastest candidates. It's designed to identify those who can adapt, who can recognize when their existing approach is failing, and develop a better one. She gestured toward the obstacle course visible through the thinning fog. Tomorrow we'll continue this process of discovery. For tonight, I suggest you reconsider everything you thought you knew about physical performance and mental resilience. As the shattered candidates limped toward the barracks, Commander Reeves approached Margaret on the beach, his expression a mixture of admiration and professional curiosity. That was quite a demonstration, Senior Chief. I counted 8 who couldn't finish your circuit. Margaret brushed sand from her uniform with practiced efficiency. 9, actually. Torres stopped during the final run. He's still on the beach behind that dune, vomiting and making bargains with God. She glanced in that direction without judgment. He won't be back tomorrow. How can you be so certain? Reeves asked. Because he's still asking the wrong questions, Margaret replied. He's wondering how he could be beaten by someone with my physical limitations, rather than recognizing that those limitations are precisely what forced me to develop superior methods. Reeves nodded thoughtfully. That's exactly why I wanted you here. These candidates arrive with impressive physical capabilities, but limited understanding of what actually matters in combat scenarios. Most training programs make the mistake of trying to find the candidates with the most physical potential, Margaret observed. But potential is useless without the wisdom to apply it correctly. Your strongest candidate today, Mitchell, initially performed worse than men with less raw ability because he was using his strength inefficiently. And you think he's beginning to understand that? Reeves asked. He's taking the first steps, Margaret replied. Tomorrow will reveal whether he can build on that insight or if he reverts to his previous approach under pressure. That night, the barracks buzzed with subdued conversations as candidates processed what they had experienced. Some nursed bruised egos along with their physical exhaustion, constructing explanations that preserved their self-image as elite athletes. Others sat in contemplative silence, recognizing that they had encountered something that challenged their fundamental understanding of performance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Candidate Mitchell sat on his bunk, methodically stretching his aching muscles while jotting notes in a small waterproof notebook. The day's events had triggered a profound reassessment of everything he thought he knew about physical training and performance. As a collegiate wrestling champion, he had dominated opponents through superior strength and technique. But today, those same attributes had nearly been his undoing. "What are you writing?" asked candidate Alvarez, whose background in marathon running had given him an advantage during the endurance portions of the evolution. "I'm documenting what I observed about Instructor Collins' technique," Mitchell replied, not looking up from his notebook. "Her swimming stroke uses a delayed catch that minimizes resistance. Her running stride is shorter than mine but perfectly timed to the terrain. Even her breathing pattern is optimized. 4-count inhale, 6-count exhale during steady exertion, switching to 2-2 when intensity increases." Alvarez looked skeptical. "You think copying an old woman's technique is going to help you through SEAL training?" Mitchell finally looked up, his expression serious. "That old woman just completed the same evolution that destroyed half our class, and she didn't even look tired. Either she's superhuman, or she knows something fundamental that we don't. I'm betting on the latter." Across the barracks, other conversations revealed the fracturing perspectives within the class. Some candidates had already decided to ring the bell, the ceremonial act of quitting by ringing a brass bell in the training compound, convinced that today's evolution proved the program wasn't what they had signed up for. Others doubled down on their existing approaches, planning to simply try harder tomorrow, believing that youth and strength would eventually prevail. Candidate Jackson, whose background in college football had given him confidence in his physical superiority, held court among a group of like-minded classmates. "This is obviously some kind of psychological test," he insisted. "They're trying to mess with our heads by having an old lady outperform us. She probably only did the first circuit and then just joined us again for the final stretch." "She was in my sight the entire time," countered Candidate Patel, a quiet former Marine who had impressed the instructors with his methodical approach. "No shortcuts, no special treatment. She completed every evolution according to standards." "Then she's on performance enhancers," Jackson replied dismissively. "There's no way someone her age can perform like that naturally." Mitchell closed his notebook, having heard enough. "Or maybe she's been doing this for 40 years and has eliminated every inefficiency from her technique. Maybe instead of making excuses, we should be figuring out what she knows that we don't." The barracks fell silent as candidates considered this perspective. Before the conversation could continue, Chief Daniels entered for evening inspection. His experienced eye took in the room's atmosphere immediately, noting which candidates appeared defeated and which seemed to be processing the day's lessons constructively. "Lights out in 10 minutes, he announced. "Tomorrow's evolution begins at 0500. Instructor Collins has requested that you all arrive having reviewed the standard demolition obstacle course procedures." A murmur ran through the barracks. The obstacle course was a notorious SEAL training challenge, designed to test both physical capabilities and problem-solving skills under pressure. Typically, it wasn't introduced until later in the training cycle, after candidates had developed foundational skills. "Is this a joke?" Jackson asked, unable to contain himself. "We're jumping straight to the demo course on day 2? Chief Daniels fixed him with a look that had silenced more confident men. "Instructor Collins believes that accelerating certain aspects of the program will more quickly reveal which candidates possess the necessary qualities for success. Do you have specific concerns about your readiness, Candidate Jackson?" Jackson stiffened. "No, Chief. No concerns." "Good," Daniels replied. "Because Instructor Collins has also announced that she'll be demonstrating the optimal approach to each obstacle before you attempt it. I suggest you pay very close attention to her technique." After Daniels departed, the barracks erupted in renewed conversation, this time with an edge of apprehension. The demolition obstacle course was legendary for its difficulty, combining physical challenges with tactical problem-solving under conditions designed to induce maximum stress. "This is getting ridiculous," Jackson muttered to his supporters. "Next, they'll have her teaching us hand-to-hand combat." Mitchell, overhearing this, smiled slightly. "Personally, I'd pay attention if she did. Something tells me Instructor Collins has more surprises in store." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Dawn broke gray and chilly over Coronado Beach as Class 347 assembled at the obstacle course. The complex arrangement of walls, ropes, tunnels, and balance challenges looked even more intimidating in the early morning light, especially to candidates still feeling the previous day's exertions in their muscles. Margaret stood at the course entrance, now dressed in standard Navy working uniform rather than PT gear. Her posture remained impeccable despite the early hour, suggesting someone who approached each day with disciplined readiness rather than reluctant obligation. "Good morning, gentlemen," she greeted them as they formed ranks. "Today we'll be addressing a fundamental misconception about combat effectiveness. Most of you believe that physical strength and speed are the primary determinants of success in challenging environments. Today you'll discover that problem-solving efficiency and technique selection are far more important than raw power." She gestured toward the imposing course. The demolition obstacle course is designed to simulate battlefield conditions where you must overcome physical barriers while maintaining tactical awareness. Most candidates approach it as a test of strength and endurance, which is why most candidates fail to complete it efficiently. Margaret moved to the first obstacle, a 15-foot wall with minimal handholds. "I'll demonstrate the optimal approach to each element. Your task is to observe, analyze, and replicate, not to simply copy my movements, but to understand the principles behind them." Several candidates exchanged skeptical glances. The wall before them required significant upper body strength to surmount, and many doubted that Margaret could demonstrate an effective technique given her age and stature. "The conventional approach," Margaret explained, "involves a running start, maximum vertical leap, and then a strength-intensive pull-up to reach the top. She gestured to Jackson, whose physical metrics suggested he would excel at such an approach. "Candidate Jackson, please demonstrate the standard technique." Jackson stepped forward with barely concealed satisfaction, clearly believing this was his opportunity to reassert the natural order after yesterday's humiliation. He backed up several paces, exploded into a powerful sprint, and launched himself at the wall. His impressive vertical leap allowed him to grab a handhold nearly 8 feet up, and his muscular arms pulled his body upward until he could secure additional grips. Within 12 seconds, he had reached the top, where he balanced momentarily before dropping down the other side. 13.4 seconds, Margaret noted, checking her stopwatch. An impressive display of athleticism that would be considered excellent by conventional standards. Jackson rejoined the group, his expression smug as he accepted nods of approval from his supporters. "Now I'll demonstrate an alternative approach," Margaret continued, moving toward the same wall without a trace of concern. Rather than backing up for a running start, she walked directly to the obstacle, studying its surface with methodical attention. After a moment's consideration, she began her ascent using a technique none of the candidates had seen before. Instead of relying on the obvious handholds that required significant upper body strength, Margaret identified subtle imperfections in the wall's surface that provided sufficient support for her carefully placed fingers and toes. Her movements were deliberate and economical, using skeletal alignment rather than muscular power to support her weight. She ascended with fluid precision, never accelerating but never pausing, each movement flowing naturally into the next. When she reached the top, she paused momentarily, just as Jackson had, before descending the other side. The entire evolution had taken her 9 seconds. The candidates stood in stunned silence as Margaret rejoined them, her breathing unchanged by the exertion. 9.2 seconds. Chief Daniels announced, his voice betraying a hint of satisfaction at their shocked expressions. "The difference," Margaret explained, "isn't athleticism, it's approach selection." Candidate Jackson used a technique that maximized his physical advantages, speed, explosive power, and upper body strength. "I used a technique that minimized the need for those attributes by identifying the most efficient path and movement pattern." She looked directly at Jackson, whose smugness had evaporated. In combat, the operator who expends maximum effort on every obstacle will be exhausted when the actual fight begins. Efficiency isn't just about completing the immediate task. It's about conserving resources for the challenges you haven't encountered yet. Margaret proceeded through the course, demonstrating similar principle-based approaches to each obstacle. For the rope climb, rather than using the powerful arm-over-arm technique the candidates had been taught, she employed a leg wrap method that transferred the load to larger muscle groups and reduced energy expenditure. For the monkey bars, she showed how slight adjustments in grip and body position could transform an arm-burning challenge into a momentum-based flow that required minimal strength. Each demonstration reinforced the same fundamental lesson. Superior technique could overcome physical limitations, and efficiency was more valuable than power in sustained operations. By the third obstacle, Mitchell had begun to recognize patterns in Margaret's approach. "She's always looking for ways to use skeletal support instead of muscular effort," he observed quietly to Patel. "And she never fights momentum, she redirects it." Patel nodded thoughtfully. "It's like watching someone who has solved the physics equation for each obstacle while the rest of us are just throwing ourselves at it and hoping for the best." When they reached the infamous lever, a horizontal ladder that required alternating over and under each rung, the contrast became even more apparent. This obstacle typically destroyed candidates' shoulders and abdominal muscles, leaving them trembling and exhausted. Jackson's approach was textbook. Powerful movements that showcased his impressive strength but drained his energy reserves visibly with each transition. Margaret, by contrast, used a technique that appeared almost lazy to the untrained eye. She moved more slowly but with such precision that she never had to correct a position or restart a movement. Her path through the obstacle created natural counterbalances that reduced the load on any single muscle group, distributing the effort throughout her body and minimizing energy expenditure. When all the candidates had completed their attempts at the full course, they reassembled at the starting point. The results were unmistakable. Even the most physically gifted had recorded times significantly slower than Margaret's, and their exhaustion was evident while she remained composed and alert. This evolution wasn't about the obstacle course, Margaret explained. It was about problem-solving under pressure. When faced with a physical challenge, your instinct is to overcome it through superior force, more strength, more speed, more power. That approach works in the short term for those with exceptional physical gifts, but it fails catastrophically in sustained operations. She paced before them, studying their reactions. Some appeared thoughtful, beginning to grasp the deeper lesson. Others remained skeptical, still searching for explanations that preserved their existing worldview. In real combat scenarios, you will face opponents who are younger, stronger, and faster than you. You will encounter environmental challenges that cannot be overcome through physical superiority alone. In those moments, your survival will depend not on how powerful you are, but on how intelligently you apply the power you have. Margaret stopped in front of Mitchell, whose performance had improved dramatically as he incorporated her techniques. Candidate Mitchell is beginning to understand this principle. By the final obstacles, he was no longer simply copying my movements. He was applying the underlying concepts to develop approaches suited to his own physical attributes. Mitchell stood slightly straighter at this recognition, though his expression remained focused rather than proud. Tomorrow, Margaret continued, we will apply these same principles to water operations. Tonight, I suggest you reflect on what you observed today. Ask yourself whether you're still trying to overcome challenges through brute force, or whether you're ready to develop more sophisticated approaches. As the candidates were dismissed for their next evolution, Commander Reeves approached Margaret at the edge of the course. Impressive demonstration, Senior Chief. Though I suspect some of them still believe you're performing some kind of trick. Margaret smiled slightly. Good. Skepticism forces them to analyze more carefully. The ones who matter will figure it out eventually. And the ones who don't? Reeves asked. They'll ring the bell, Margaret replied matter-of-factly. Better to identify that limitation now than discover it when lives depend on their judgment. That evening, the barracks atmosphere had shifted noticeably. The initial skepticism and resentment toward Margaret had fragmented into various perspectives. Some candidates, like Jackson, remained committed to their established approaches, viewing the day's lessons as irrelevant to real SEAL operations. Others had begun the difficult process of reconsidering fundamental assumptions about performance and effectiveness. Mitchell had expanded his notebook observations, now documenting not just specific techniques but the principles behind them. It's about eliminating unnecessary effort, he explained to a small group that had gathered around his bunk. Everything she does serves multiple purposes simultaneously. When she climbs, her hand placements are setting up her next 3 moves. When she traverses the weaver, she's using the structure itself to support her weight rather than fighting gravity. But that's not how we were taught, objected Candidate Rodriguez, a former Marine with extensive combat experience. Every instructor until now has emphasized maximum effort and pushing through pain barriers. Maybe because that's easier to teach, suggested Patel. It's simple to tell someone to try harder. It's much more difficult to teach them how to try smarter. Before the discussion could continue, an unexpected visitor entered the barracks. The candidates jumped to attention as they recognized Captain Eleanor Reeves, Commander Reeves, wife and the base's senior medical officer. Her presence in the barracks was unusual, especially after hours. "At ease, gentlemen," she said, her professional demeanor softened by a hint of amusement at their reaction. "I'm here to provide some context that might help you better understand your current training situation." She moved to the center of the room, where all could see and hear her clearly. "I understand you've had an interesting introduction to Instructor Collins. Some of you are probably still wondering how she's able to outperform candidates half her age with twice her muscle mass." Several heads nodded cautiously, unwilling to voice the questions that had been circulating throughout the day. 30 years ago, Captain Reeves continued, I was a junior medical officer assigned to a classified Navy research program studying human performance optimization. Our task was to identify the physiological and psychological factors that allowed certain operators to function effectively in conditions that incapacitated others with similar or superior physical attributes. She paused, letting the implications of this statement register. Margaret Collins was our primary research subject for over 5 years, not because she possessed extraordinary genetic advantages or physical capabilities, but because she consistently outperformed subjects who did. The barracks had gone completely silent. Every candidate focused intently on Captain Reeves' words. What we discovered was revolutionary. While most military training focused on developing maximum physical capacity, how much weight you could lift, how fast you could run, how long you could endure, the most effective operators weren't those with the highest physical metrics. They were those who had developed the most efficient techniques for applying the capacity they had. Captain Reeves glanced around the room, noting which candidates were processing this information thoughtfully and which remained skeptical. Margaret Collins never set any records for raw strength or speed. What she did instead was eliminate every unnecessary movement, every wasted effort, every inefficient technique from her operational approach. She developed methods that allowed her to complete missions that destroyed operators with far superior physical capabilities. She smiled slightly, remembering. When we first started studying her, the special operations community was skeptical. They sent their best operators to demonstrate how superior strength and speed would always prevail over technique. She systematically outperformed every one of them, not by being stronger or faster, but by being fundamentally more efficient. Captain Reeves continued, her voice carrying the weight of scientific authority combined with personal witness. The research program eventually expanded to study dozens of elite operators, but Margaret remained our baseline, the standard against which all others were measured. What made her unique wasn't just her technical efficiency but her analytical approach to problem-solving under extreme conditions. The candidates listened with rapt attention, their previous skepticism giving way to genuine curiosity about the woman who had been systematically dismantling their preconceptions. When Margaret retired from active service, she took her expertise to the private sector, developing training methodologies for specialized units worldwide. Her techniques have been incorporated into the operational approaches of every elite military and law enforcement organization on the planet, though few know the source. Captain Reeves smiled slightly. Until today, none of you had heard of Margaret Collins, yet every special operations manual you've ever studied contains principles she pioneered. She surveyed the room one final time. You have a rare opportunity to learn directly from someone who has forgotten more about operational efficiency than most instructors will ever know. I suggest you take full advantage of it. With that, Captain Reeves departed, leaving the barracks in thoughtful silence. The revelation had transformed the narrative completely. Margaret Collins wasn't just an unusual instructor brought in for psychological effect. She was a living legend whose methods had shaped special operations doctrine for decades. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The following morning, Class 347 assembled at the combat training pool with markedly different attitudes. The dismissive amusement had vanished, replaced by focused attention as Margaret outlined the day's evolution. Water operations represent the SEAL in Navy SEAL, she began. Today's evolution will assess your efficiency in the aquatic environment, where human beings are inherently disadvantaged. This is where technique becomes not just advantageous, but essential for survival. She gestured toward the Olympic-sized pool, where training staff had arranged various obstacles and equipment stations. We'll begin with basic underwater confidence drills, then progress to tactical swimming approaches, culminating in simulated underwater problem-solving scenarios. The candidates nodded, their expressions serious. This was familiar territory for most. Water confidence was a prerequisite for Bud-S selection, and many had backgrounds in competitive swimming or water rescue. Before we start, Margaret continued, I want to address a common misconception about combat swimming. Most candidates believe that lung capacity is the primary determinant of underwater performance. They focus on holding their breath longer, pushing through the physiological alarm signals that indicate approaching hypoxia. She shook her head slightly. This approach is not just inefficient, it's potentially lethal in combat scenarios. Instead, we'll focus on maximizing what you can accomplish with each breath cycle, minimizing oxygen consumption through proper technique, and recognizing the actual limits of human performance in water. The first evolution was deceptively simple, a 50-meter underwater swim with no equipment. Candidates would start at one end of the pool, submerge and swim to the other end without surfacing. Standard procedure for this exercise emphasized powerful strokes and maximum lung capacity. Candidate Jackson, Margaret called. Please demonstrate the conventional approach. Jackson, still nursing resentment from the previous day's lessons but now tempered with grudging respect, moved to the starting position. At Margaret's signal, he took several deep breaths to maximize his oxygen levels, then filled his lungs completely before submerging. His underwater technique was textbook, powerful dolphin kicks that propelled him forward with impressive speed. He reached the far end in just over 30 seconds, surfacing with an explosive exhale and immediately gulping air to replenish his depleted oxygen. 31.5 seconds, Margaret noted. Excellent time by conventional standards, though I noted significant oxygen debt upon completion, which would compromise subsequent operations in a combat scenario. She moved to the starting position. Now I'll demonstrate an alternative approach that prioritizes oxygen conservation over speed. Rather than taking multiple preparatory breaths, Margaret took just one modestly deep inhalation before submerging. Her underwater technique appeared almost leisurely compared to Jackson's powerful movements. Instead of continuous dolphin kicks, she used a modified breaststroke that incorporated subtle gliding phases between propulsive movements. Her pace was slower but remarkably consistent, with no acceleration or deceleration throughout the 50 meters. When she surfaced at the far end, she exhaled normally and continued breathing at her regular cadence, showing none of the gasping recovery that Jackson had displayed. Her time was 35 seconds, slower than Jackson's but achieved with dramatically less oxygen consumption. The difference, Margaret explained as the candidates gathered at the pool edge, isn't in the time but in the physiological state upon completion. Candidate Jackson performed admirably but depleted his oxygen reserves completely. In a combat scenario, he would be vulnerable for the critical seconds while he recovered. My approach preserves sufficient reserves to remain combat effective immediately upon surfacing. She gestured toward the pool. In operational settings, an extra 4 seconds underwater is rarely decisive, but the ability to emerge ready for immediate action rather than compromised by oxygen debt can mean the difference between success and failure, or between life and death. The candidates processed this insight with varying degrees of acceptance. For those like Mitchell, who had already begun to appreciate Margaret's methodical approach, it reinforced their evolving understanding. For others, it represented another challenge to deeply held beliefs about performance and effort. For the next evolution, Margaret continued, we'll address drown-proofing techniques. The conventional approach emphasizes endurance, how long you can continue the exercise. We'll focus instead on efficiency, how little energy you expend while maintaining the required position. Drown-proofing was a notorious budge-S exercise where candidates had their hands and feet bound before entering deep water. They had to float, swim, and perform various maneuvers while effectively handicapped, simulating the challenges of operating while injured or restrained. Candidate Rodriguez demonstrated the standard technique, which involved rhythmic vertical movement to maintain buoyancy, bobbing up for quick breaths before submerging again. His performance was competent but visibly strenuous, his face showing increasing strain as the minutes passed. Margaret's demonstration, by contrast, appeared almost restful. Rather than fighting against her restraints, she incorporated them into her technique, using the bound position to create a more hydrodynamic profile. Her movements were minimal, just enough to maintain position and access air when needed, but never exceeding the necessary effort. Conservation of energy is the foundation of sustained operations, Margaret explained after completing the evolution with apparent ease. Every unnecessary movement, every muscle contracted with more force than required, represents energy wasted that could determine your operational longevity. Throughout the morning, Margaret systematically deconstructed each conventional water training approach and demonstrated alternatives that achieved equal or superior results with significantly less exertion. By lunchtime, even the most skeptical candidates had begun to recognize the validity of her methods, though many struggled to implement them effectively. Don't be discouraged by initial difficulty, Margaret advised as they broke for a brief meal. You are attempting to override movement patterns that have been reinforced throughout your lives. Your bodies are accustomed to applying maximum effort to overcome challenges. Recalibrating to optimal rather than maximum effort requires patience and conscious practice. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The afternoon session introduced a new dimension to the training: decision-making under physiological stress. The evolution involved navigating an underwater obstacle course while solving tactical problems presented at various stations. Conventional training emphasized pushing through the discomfort of limited oxygen to complete the course as quickly as possible. Combat effectiveness isn't just about physical capability, Margaret explained. It's about maintaining cognitive function when your body is under extreme stress. Many operators can push themselves physically but experience significant degradation in decision-making quality as oxygen levels decrease. She demonstrated a technique that integrated breathing control with task prioritization, showing how proper preparation and movement efficiency could preserve cognitive function even in oxygen-limited environments. The candidates who attempted to replicate her approach discovered that they could complete the cognitive tasks with greater accuracy, even if their overall times were slightly slower. The operational value of arriving somewhere 4 seconds faster but making a critical error in judgment is negative, Margaret observed. Better to take slightly longer and maintain full cognitive capability throughout the evolution. By day's end, Class 347 had experienced a fundamental shift in perspective. What had begun as skepticism toward an apparently mismatched instructor had evolved into genuine respect for Margaret's capabilities and methods. More importantly, they had begun to question basic assumptions about performance that had shaped their entire approach to training. As they dried off and prepared to return to the barracks, Margaret gathered them for a final observation. Today, you've seen how technical efficiency can overcome apparent physical limitations in the water environment. Tomorrow, we'll apply these same principles to a more complex evolution, the infamous Hell Week obstacle course competition. A murmur ran through the group. The Hell Week course was legendary for its brutality, combining every physical challenge in the SEAL training repertoire into a single grueling test that pushed candidates to absolute limits. The standard approach to this course results in a 60% failure rate, Margaret noted. Using the principles we've been discussing, I expect every one of you who applies them correctly to complete it successfully. That evening, the barracks atmosphere had transformed completely. Instead of fragmented cliques defined by skepticism or belief, the candidates had formed study groups focused on understanding and implementing Margaret's methods. Even Jackson, whose initial resistance had been strongest, was carefully reviewing his notes and discussing technique refinements with others. Mitchell had emerged as an unofficial leader in this analytical approach, his background in competitive wrestling providing a foundation for understanding the biomechanical principles Margaret had demonstrated. It's about treating your body as a system rather than a collection of individual muscles, he explained to a group gathered around his bunk. Every movement should serve multiple functions simultaneously. But how do you maintain that level of awareness during high-stress evolutions? Asked Candidate Walsh, a former Army Ranger whose brute force approach had served him well until now. When everything's going to hell, instinct takes over. That's exactly what Collins is trying to change, Mitchell replied. She's rewiring our instincts so that efficiency becomes our default response to stress, not maximum effort. Quote, the discussion continued late into the night, with candidates sharing observations and insights from the day's training. What had begun as an imposed instruction was evolving into collaborative learning, with each candidate contributing perspectives from their unique backgrounds and experiences. The following morning dawned clear and cool, perfect conditions for the Hell Week obstacle course competition. The course stretched across 2 miles of Coronado's varied terrain, incorporating every physical challenge a SEAL candidate might face: climbing walls, rope traverses, mud crawls, water obstacles, and load-bearing exercises, all designed to push human endurance to its absolute limits. Class 347 assembled at the starting point, where Margaret and Commander Reeves waited. The candidates appeared focused rather than anxious, their expressions suggesting thoughtful preparation rather than nervous energy. Today's evolution will test everything we've discussed over the past 3 days, Margaret began. You'll face obstacles that challenge your strength, endurance, problem-solving, and tactical awareness. The conventional approach would have you attack each obstacle with maximum effort, pushing through pain barriers through sheer determination. She paused, studying their faces for comprehension. That approach works for some, those with exceptional physical capabilities and pain tolerance. But it fails for most, not because they lack courage or determination, but because it's fundamentally inefficient. Margaret gestured toward the imposing course that stretched before them. Today, I want you to approach each obstacle as a problem to be solved, rather than a barrier to be overcome. Analyze before acting. Identify the path of least resistance. Apply precisely the effort required. No more, no less. Commander Reeves stepped forward. This is not a timed competition in the traditional sense. There is no advantage to finishing first if you've depleted your operational capacity in the process. The objective is to complete the course while maintaining combat effectiveness throughout. Margaret nodded in agreement. In real operations, the mission isn't over when you reach the objective. Often, that's precisely when you need your full capabilities intact. Planning your energy expenditure throughout the entire operation is essential to mission success. She moved to the starting position. I'll navigate the course first, demonstrating the principles we've discussed. Your task is not to copy my specific techniques, which are adapted to my physical attributes, but to apply the underlying concepts to your own approach. The candidates watched intently as Margaret began the course, moving with the same methodical efficiency they had observed in previous evolutions. Her approach to each obstacle revealed careful analysis rather than reactive response. Where conventional techniques would employ explosive power, she used leverage and momentum. Where others would muscle through resistance, she found paths that minimized it. Most striking was her pacing, consistent and sustainable throughout the course, with no visible fatigue or recovery periods. She completed each obstacle with the same measured precision, whether it was the first or the 15th in sequence. When she finished the entire course, her breathing and movement quality appeared virtually unchanged from when she had started. "The course is now yours," Margaret announced upon returning to the starting point. "Remember, this isn't about how fast you can go or how much pain you can endure. It's about how intelligently you can apply your capabilities to achieve the objective while preserving operational readiness." What followed was unlike any obstacle course competition in Bud/S history. Instead of the usual chaotic sprint that left candidates gasping and exhausted midway through, Class 347 approached the course with deliberate assessment. They studied each obstacle before engaging, identified optimal paths based on their individual physical attributes, and applied techniques that prioritized efficiency over raw power. Mitchell, whose analytical approach had accelerated his adoption of Margaret's principles, moved through the course with remarkable economy of motion. Where he once would have relied on his wrestling strength to power through challenges, he now used body positioning and momentum to achieve the same results with minimal exertion. His performance wasn't the fastest, but he maintained consistent energy levels throughout the entire evolution. Even Jackson, whose initial skepticism had been most pronounced, showed significant adaptation in his approach. His impressive physical capabilities, now directed with greater precision, allowed him to navigate the course with an efficiency that would have been impossible days earlier. Though occasional flashes of his maximum effort instincts emerged under stress, he quickly recognized and corrected these reactions. Commander Reeves observed the proceedings with Chief Daniels, both noting the dramatic difference from typical class performances. "I've never seen anything like this," Daniels remarked. "Usually by the midpoint we've got candidates falling out from exhaustion or injury. These guys look like they could run the course again immediately." Reeves nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly the point. Special operations isn't about who can push hardest for a single evolution. It's about who can maintain effectiveness through sustained challenges." Margaret's approach is transforming their fundamental understanding of performance. As candidates completed the course, they gathered at the finish point, where Margaret observed their condition with clinical assessment. Unlike typical post-evolution scenes where exhausted candidates collapsed in various states of depletion, Class 347 remained standing, fatigued but functional, their breathing elevated but controlled. "Notice your current physiological state," Margaret instructed as the last candidate finished. "Compare it to how you felt after similar physical challenges in the past. The difference isn't that today's course was easier. It wasn't. The difference is in how you approached it." She moved among them, studying their recovery patterns with professional interest. "In conventional training, we celebrate the willingness to push beyond perceived limits, to continue when your body screams for you to stop. There's value in that lesson, but it's incomplete. Today, you've experienced the alternative, how to accomplish the same objective without reaching those limits in the first place." Margaret stopped before Mitchell, whose performance had most closely aligned with the principles she had been teaching. Candidate Mitchell, what was your key insight from today's evolution? Mitchell considered the question carefully. That perceived limits are often just inefficient approaches. When I hit points where I would normally need to push through with determination, I found that changing my technique often eliminated the need to push at all. Margaret nodded approvingly. Exactly. The sensation we interpret as approaching our limits is frequently just feedback that our current approach is inefficient. The truly elite operator doesn't ignore that feedback through superior willpower. They respond to it by finding a better way. She addressed the entire class. This doesn't mean that determination and mental toughness aren't valuable qualities. There will absolutely be situations where you must continue, despite pain, fatigue, and doubt. But those situations should be the exception, not your standard operating procedure. Commander Reeves stepped forward. Congratulations to all of you who completed today's evolution. You've demonstrated not just physical capability but the capacity to adapt your approach based on new information, perhaps the most essential quality in special operations. He surveyed the group with evident satisfaction. Tomorrow begins the notorious Hell Week. 5.5 days of continuous physical activity with minimal sleep. Historically, this is where we lose 50% or more of each class. Based on what I've observed today, I expect substantially different results from Class 347. As the candidates were dismissed to prepare for the coming challenge, Margaret remained behind with Commander Reeves and Chief Daniels. They're progressing faster than I anticipated, she observed. Especially Mitchell and, surprisingly, Jackson. His resistance was strong initially, but once he accepted the validity of the approach, his physical gifts became genuine advantages rather than crutches. Reeves nodded thoughtfully. Do you think they're ready for Hell Week with this new perspective? It's one thing to apply these principles during discrete evolutions, quite another to maintain them through days of sleep deprivation and continuous stress. That's precisely why Hell Week exists, Margaret replied. Not to see who's physically toughest or most determined, though those qualities matter, but to identify who can maintain effective decision-making under extreme conditions. The candidates who truly internalize what we've been teaching will perform dramatically better than those who revert to brute force approaches when stress increases. That evening, as Class 347 prepared for the coming ordeal, the barracks atmosphere reflected their transformed perspective. Rather than the typical pre-Hell Week scene of nervous energy and bravado, the candidates engaged in methodical preparation, reviewing techniques, discussing energy conservation strategies, and mentally rehearsing their approaches to known challenges. Mitchell sat cross-legged on his bunk, eyes closed in meditation, practicing the breathing patterns Margaret had demonstrated for optimizing oxygen utilization under stress. Nearby, Jackson methodically arranged his gear, his movements deliberate and efficient where they would once have been hurried and forceful. It's strange, Jackson remarked to no one in particular. 3 days ago, I thought this program was about proving I was stronger and tougher than everyone else. Now I understand that's not the point at all. What is the point, then? Asked Rodriguez, who had been listening nearby. Jackson considered the question with uncharacteristic thoughtfulness. It's about becoming someone who can solve problems that can't be overcome through strength alone. Someone who sees options that others miss because they're too busy trying to power through obstacles rather than navigate around them. Hell Week began at midnight with the traditional cacophony of smoke grenades, simulated gunfire, and instructors shouting contradictory commands designed to induce immediate stress and confusion. Candidates scrambled from their bunks into the cold night air, where fire hoses sprayed them with frigid water as they assembled in formation. The scene was deliberately chaotic, designed to strip away composed thinking and trigger reactive responses. Under normal circumstances, most candidates reverted to instinctive patterns in this environment, fighting through challenges with desperate effort rather than methodical approach. Class 347, however, showed the first signs of their transformed perspective immediately. Despite the disorientation and physical shock, they moved with surprising coordination, forming ranks with minimal wasted motion and maintaining controlled breathing patterns even as instructors screamed inches from their faces. Margaret observed from the sidelines, her expression revealing nothing as she studied their responses. She had purposely remained absent from the Hell Week preparation briefings, curious to see whether the principles she had taught would survive first contact with this legendary crucible. Begin with 4-count breathing. Mitchell called out to his classmates, his voice calm despite the chaos surrounding them. Assess before acting. Find your efficiency. The reminder rippled through the formation, candidates nodding almost imperceptibly as they implemented the techniques they had practiced. Where other classes might have been shattered by the initial shock, Class 347 was rapidly regaining composure, their expressions showing focused attention rather than panicked reaction. "Into the surf," shouted Chief Daniels, directing them toward the ocean where the real test would begin. "Move! Move! Move!" The candidates double-timed to the water's edge, where midnight waves crashed in darkness, barely illuminated by distant spotlights. The Pacific in February offered a particular kind of misery. Cold enough to accelerate hypothermia, but not cold enough to numb the discomfort quickly. Typically, this evolution devolved into a chaotic scramble, as candidates fought against both the ocean and their own mounting panic. Class 347 instead formed efficient teams of two, partners monitoring each other's technique and conserving heat through proper positioning in the water. "Look at that," Chief Daniels remarked to Margaret as they observed from shore. "They're implementing thermal efficiency protocols without being instructed. I've never seen a class this coordinated this early in Hell Week." Margaret nodded slightly. They're beginning to understand that mutual support isn't just about encouragement. It's about optimizing collective performance through proper technique. The night progressed through a series of increasingly demanding evolutions, log PT, where teams carried heavy logs through obstacle courses, sand crawls under barbed wire, and shuttle runs while carrying wounded teammates. Throughout each challenge, Class 347 maintained their focus on efficient movement and optimal effort distribution. Most striking was their recovery between evolutions. Where typical Hell Week candidates showed progressive deterioration in form and function, Class 347 used even brief transition periods to implement recovery techniques. Margaret had taught them controlled breathing, specific muscle relaxation sequences, and microdosing rest to maximize its benefits. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. By dawn of the first day, when most classes had already lost several candidates to exhaustion or voluntary withdrawal, Class 347 remained intact. They stood shivering on the beach as the sun rose, their faces showing fatigue but not defeat as they prepared for the coming day's challenges. "Boat crews!" shouted an instructor. "Form up for IBS training?" The inflatable boat Small, IBS Evolution, was notorious for breaking candidates. Teams of 7 carried the 170-pound rubber boats on their heads for miles, ran with them into the surf, paddled through breaking waves, then returned to shore to repeat the process endlessly. It combined every miserable aspect of Hell Week: cold, weight-bearing exertion, team coordination challenges, and constant saltwater immersion. Mitchell's boat crew, which included Jackson and 4 others, approached their assigned craft with deliberate assessment rather than resigned dread. "Remember," Mitchell said quietly, "it's not about powering through. It's about identifying the optimal carrying positions based on individual heights and strengths." They arranged themselves in height order, with specific adjustments for shoulder width and arm length, creating a balanced distribution that minimized strain on any individual. When they lifted the boat, their movement was synchronized and fluid, raising it to carrying position with minimal wasted energy. The instructor watching them narrowed his eyes, recognizing a deviation from the usual struggling approach. "That's some fancy technique you've got there," he commented, his tone suggesting disapproval of innovation. "Let's see how it holds up after 4 hours." Margaret, who had been observing nearby, approached the instructor. "Petty Officer Davis, I believe? I'd be interested in your assessment of their approach." Davis straightened slightly, recognizing Margaret's authority despite her unassuming appearance. "It's unorthodox, ma'am. Not the standard technique we teach." "And what is the standard technique designed to accomplish?" Margaret asked mildly. Davis hesitated, his certainty wavering. "To build team cohesion through shared suffering, ma'am. To identify which candidates can push through pain and fatigue." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Valid training objectives. But consider this. If a team discovers a more efficient approach that accomplishes the mission while preserving combat effectiveness, isn't that actually superior to one that depletes them unnecessarily? She gestured toward Mitchell's crew, now moving down the beach with surprising grace considering the awkward load they carried. They're still experiencing sufficient stress to test their resilience. They're still building cohesion, but they're also demonstrating tactical problem-solving under pressure, identifying and implementing superior techniques rather than mindlessly following convention. Davis considered this perspective, his expression thoughtful. I suppose in actual operations we'd want them finding the most effective approach rather than the most painful one. Exactly, Margaret replied. The question isn't whether they can endure suffering. That's a given requirement for special operations. The question is whether they can think clearly enough while suffering to find better solutions. As Hell Week progressed into its second and third days, the contrast between Class 347's approach and traditional methods became increasingly apparent. While they experienced the same physical challenges and sleep deprivation as any Hell Week class, their performance degradation curve was dramatically different. Typically, candidate effectiveness declined sharply after the first 24 hours without sleep, with further significant drops at 48 and 72 hours. Class 347, however, showed a much more gradual decline, maintaining operational effectiveness well beyond the point where most classes had deteriorated to mere survival mode. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The explanation became clear during the night maritime navigation evolution on Day 3. Teams were required to plan and execute tactical movement through a series of waypoints in darkness, carrying full gear and a simulated casualty. This evolution tested not just physical endurance, but cognitive function under extreme fatigue. Commander Reeves and Margaret observed as Mitchell's team gathered to plan their approach. Despite 72 hours of continuous physical activity with less than 4 hours of accumulated sleep, they conducted a methodical analysis that would have impressed rested operators. "We need to prioritize energy conservation," Mitchell said. His voice hoarse from days of saltwater exposure, but his thinking remarkably clear. The route through these 3 waypoints has significant elevation changes. Standard approach would be direct lines, but that maximizes unnecessary climbing. Quote, Jackson, whose transformation from skeptic to convert had been among the most dramatic, traced an alternative path on the map. If we contour around these slopes instead of going over them, we add distance but reduce total energy expenditure. The carrying team rotates every 100 meters instead of every 50, but with smoother transitions to minimize wasted motion. The team discussed the plan with focused efficiency, each member contributing observations from their unique perspective. There was no posturing, no unnecessary discussion, just collaborative problem-solving directed toward optimal mission execution. "They're still thinking," Reeves remarked quietly to Margaret. 72 hours in, and they're still making complex tactical decisions rather than just reacting. Margaret nodded. "Because they've been conserving cognitive resources along with physical ones. Efficient movement patterns require less neural processing, which preserves decision-making capability even under extreme fatigue." As the teams deployed into the darkness, Margaret moved to a vantage point where she could observe multiple groups simultaneously. The differences in approach were striking. Teams composed of candidates who had most fully embraced her methods moved with ghost-like efficiency through the terrain, their formations tight and their movements economical. Others, who had incorporated the techniques less completely, showed visible signs of struggle despite their best efforts. By the 4th day, Hell Week had claimed its inevitable casualties. 5 candidates had withdrawn voluntarily, unable to continue despite their determination. 2 others had been removed for medical reasons, hypothermia and soft tissue injuries that prevented safe continuation. But remarkably, 21 of the original 28 remained, a retention rate unprecedented in Bud/S history. The morning of Day 5 brought the culminating evolution, the dreaded around-the-world course that incorporated every physical challenge from the previous days into a single extended test of endurance and will. Teams would navigate a 15-mile course carrying boats, logs, and simulated casualties, completing complex tasks at each waypoint, while instructors applied maximum pressure to induce failure. As Class 347 prepared for this final crucible, Margaret gathered them for an unexpected briefing. Her own appearance showed no signs of the sleep deprivation she had shared with them, monitoring their progress throughout the entire ordeal. "Before you begin this final evolution," she said, her voice carrying easily despite their exhaustion-dulled senses, "I want you to understand what you've already accomplished. Not just surviving to this point, though that alone is significant, but how you've done it." She moved among them, studying their faces with clinical interest. Despite 5 days of continuous activity, saltwater immersion, and minimal sleep, they remained alert and responsive, their eyes focused, and their posture suggesting readiness rather than depletion. In traditional Hell Week classes, candidates at this stage are operating at approximately 30% of their normal physical and cognitive capacity. Based on my observations, you're functioning at closer to 60%, a dramatic difference that would translate directly to operational effectiveness in actual combat scenarios. Margaret stopped before Mitchell, whose leadership throughout the ordeal had been quietly transformative. "You've demonstrated that superior technique doesn't just allow you to complete tasks more efficiently, it fundamentally changes what humans are capable of accomplishing under extreme conditions." She addressed the entire group. "The around-the-world evolution is designed to push you beyond your perceived limits, to find out who will continue when every fiber of their being screams to stop. You will certainly experience that threshold today, but you'll reach it with significantly more resources intact than any previous class, because you've been operating on a fundamentally different paradigm." Margaret's expression softened slightly, showing the first hint of the pride she felt in their accomplishment. "Whatever happens today, remember what you've learned. Not just about physical performance, but about the human capacity to transcend apparent limitations through intelligent application of effort rather than mere force of will." The around-the-world evolution lived up to its fearsome reputation. For 15 grueling hours, Class 347 navigated the course, facing challenges designed to exploit every weakness and break every resolve. They carried crushing loads through punishing terrain, completed complex problem-solving tasks while shivering uncontrollably from cold water immersion, and endured the psychological pressure of instructors who identified and targeted individual vulnerabilities with surgical precision. Throughout this ultimate test, they maintained the approach Margaret had taught them, analyzing before acting, identifying the path of least resistance, applying precisely the necessary effort, and no more. When conventional technique failed, they adapted rather than doubled down on ineffective approaches. When teammates faltered, they redistributed loads based on remaining capabilities rather than equal sharing of burdens. As darkness fell on the 5th day, Mitchell's team approached the final waypoint, a punishing uphill carrying evolution with their IBS boat and a 200-pound log. By any reasonable assessment, they should have been beyond effective function, reduced to the shambling determination that typically characterized Hell Week's final stages. Instead, they paused briefly to assess the challenge and develop an approach. Despite their extreme fatigue, their analysis remained methodical, and their execution coordinated. They created a carrying formation that optimized their remaining strength, with specific adjustments for the incline they faced. "Remember," Mitchell said, his voice barely audible after days of exertion, "it's not about whether we can power through. It's about finding the approach that accomplishes the mission most effectively with the resources we have left." Jackson nodded, his expression showing exhausted comprehension. "Optimal, not maximum," he whispered, repeating one of Margaret's foundational principles. Their ascent wasn't pretty. Nothing could be after 5 days of continuous activity, but it displayed a level of coordinated effectiveness that stunned the observing instructors. They reached the summit not through superior physical capabilities, which had been depleted days earlier, but through superior problem-solving that maximized their remaining resources. As the final teams completed the course and Hell Week officially concluded, Commander Reeves gathered the surviving candidates. 20 of the original 28 stood before him, a 71% completion rate that shattered all previous records. "Congratulations," Reeves began, his voice carrying genuine respect. "You've completed one of the most demanding training evolutions in military history, but more significantly, you've demonstrated a new paradigm for human performance under extreme conditions." He gestured toward Margaret, who stood quietly at the edge of the formation. "Instructor Collins came here to test a hypothesis, that the limiting factor in special operations wasn't physical capability or mental toughness, but inefficient application of those qualities. You have provided compelling evidence supporting that hypothesis. Reeves surveyed the exhausted but still functional candidates with evident satisfaction. Traditional Hell Week classes at this stage are medically classified as combat ineffective, physically present but operationally useless until after significant recovery. Our medical team's assessment indicates that you remain at approximately 50% combat effectiveness, a transformation in what we believed possible. The candidates stood a little straighter despite their fatigue, recognition of their accomplishment providing a final surge of energy. This doesn't mean the traditional emphasis on mental toughness and physical capacity was wrong, Reeves continued. Those qualities remain essential for special operations. What you've demonstrated is that those qualities can be amplified dramatically through superior technique and approach selection. He nodded toward Margaret. Senior Chief Collins will provide some final observations before you're dismissed for well-deserved recovery. Margaret stepped forward, studying them with the same evaluative gaze they had first encountered a week earlier, though now it carried unmistakable approval rather than clinical assessment. When I arrived here, she began, most of you viewed me as a curiosity at best, a joke at worst. You couldn't conceive how someone with my apparent limitations could contribute to your development as operators. She smiled slightly, the expression transforming her weathered face. That perception was your first obstacle, one created not by external challenges but by your own preconceptions about human capability. Margaret moved among them, making eye contact with each candidate. Over the past week, you've systematically dismantled those preconceptions, replacing them with a more sophisticated understanding of performance. You've learned that effectiveness isn't determined by how much power you can generate, but by how intelligently you apply the power you have. She stopped before Mitchell, whose leadership had been instrumental in the class's transformation. You've discovered that the most significant limitations aren't physical but conceptual, the boundaries created by how we think about challenges rather than the challenges themselves. Margaret addressed the entire group once more. In actual operations, you will face opponents with superior numbers, equipment, or position. You will encounter environmental conditions that no amount of physical conditioning can overcome. In those moments, your survival and success will depend not on being stronger or tougher than the situation demands, but on finding approaches that render those advantages irrelevant. She straightened to her full height, her bearing now revealing the command presence that had been deliberately concealed upon her arrival. That is the true lesson of your experience here. Not just that Margaret Collins, at 60 years old, could outperform candidates half her age, but why that was possible. Not because I possess extraordinary physical gifts, but because I've spent 40 years eliminating inefficiency from every aspect of operational performance. Margaret's expression became serious. The techniques you've learned this week represent just the beginning of this journey. As you progress through Bud/S and into operational roles, continue questioning conventional approaches. Ask not just whether you can endure challenges, but whether there are more intelligent ways to overcome them. She smiled again, this time with genuine warmth. Remember that the most dangerous weapon you possess isn't your strength, your endurance, or even your determination, though all are essential. It's your capacity to analyze challenges clearly even under extreme stress and develop approaches that others can't envision. After the candidates were dismissed for medical evaluation and recovery, Margaret remained with Commander Reeves, watching as they moved toward the medical facility with the measured gait of those conserving their remaining energy. I'd say your experiment was a resounding success, Reeves observed. 71% completion rate, and those who finished are in dramatically better condition than we typically see. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. The principles work when properly applied. The challenge will be integrating them into standard training without losing the essential pressure that reveals character. We'll find the balance, Reeves assured her. More importantly, these candidates will carry these methods into operational teams, where they'll influence the next generation of special operators. 6 months later, Class 347 graduated from Bud/S with 19 of the original 28 candidates receiving their Trident pins, another record that attracted attention throughout the special operations community. Their performance during the qualification course had been consistently exceptional, particularly in extended operations where endurance and sustained effectiveness were critical factors. Margaret attended the graduation ceremony, watching with quiet satisfaction as each newly qualified SEAL received the insignia that marked their achievement. Her official role as Special Instructor had concluded after Hell Week, but her influence remained evident in how the candidates approached each subsequent challenge. After the ceremony, Mitchell sought her out, his bearing now reflecting the quiet confidence of someone who had not just survived extraordinary challenges, but fundamentally understood why he had succeeded where others had failed. Senior Chief Collins, he greeted her with sincere respect. "I wanted to thank you personally before deploying. What you taught us transformed not just my performance but my entire understanding of human capability." Margaret studied him with the same evaluative gaze she had used upon their first meeting, though now it carried approval rather than assessment. "You were ready for the lesson, Mr. Mitchell. Many aren't. They remain trapped in the belief that superior force is the answer to every challenge." Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. "I've been wondering, how did you develop these methods initially? Was there a specific moment when you recognized the traditional approach was fundamentally limited?" "There was," Margaret acknowledged, her expression suggesting memories rarely shared. "During my first Special Operations qualification course, I encountered a challenge I simply couldn't overcome through conventional means. I wasn't strong enough to complete the evolution using the standard technique, despite maximum effort." She smiled slightly. "Rather than accepting failure, I analyzed the task from first principles, identifying an alternative approach that required less raw strength but more precise technique. I completed the evolution and discovered something transformative in the process, that most operational challenges have multiple potential solutions, some requiring far fewer resources than others." Margaret's gaze became distant, remembering. "From that point forward, I approached every aspect of training differently, not asking how much force I could generate, but how little was actually required when properly applied." "That's the perspective I'll take into operational roles," Mitchell assured her, "finding the approach that accomplishes the mission most effectively, not just the one that displays the most impressive effort." Margaret nodded with satisfaction. "That's the lesson that matters. In real operations, there are no points for difficulty, no medals for unnecessary suffering. There's only mission accomplishment and operator survival, both of which depend on intelligent application of resources rather than their maximum expenditure." As they parted ways, Mitchell joining his classmates and Margaret preparing to return to her consulting role with various special operations units, Commander Reeves approached with news that would extend her influence even further. "The training command has reviewed the data from Class 347, he informed her. "They've authorized implementation of your methodologies across all BUD/classes, beginning next month. They're calling it the Efficiency-Based Operator Development Program." Margaret received this news with characteristic understatement. The name doesn't matter. What matters is that future operators will have tools that maximize their effectiveness while preserving their longevity. And it all started because a bunch of cocky young candidates laughed at the idea that a 60-year-old woman could teach them anything about elite performance, Reeves observed with a smile. "Their laughter was understandable," Margaret replied. "Their preconceptions were based on limited experience. What matters is that when presented with evidence challenging those preconceptions, they were willing to adapt rather than defend failed assumptions." She glanced toward the graduating class, where Mitchell and his teammates were celebrating their achievement with the contained pride of those who understood its true significance. That quality, the willingness to discard comfortable beliefs in favor of demonstrable reality, is what separates elite operators from everyone else. As Margaret departed the Naval Special Warfare Center for the last time, she carried the satisfaction of knowing that her methods would influence generations of special operators yet to come. The young men who had laughed at her appearance on that first morning had become the pioneers of a new approach to human performance, one that recognized efficiency, not just effort, as the foundation of operational excellence. Their journey had transformed not just their capabilities, but their understanding of human potential, proving that the most significant limitations we face are often not physical but conceptual, created by how we think about challenges rather than the challenges themselves. In transcending those limitations, they had discovered capacity for achievement beyond anything they had previously imagined possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.